Hi, in this lecture, we're going to start our study of the nervous system with Chapter 11, Nervous Tissue. In our first lecture, we're just going to look at some general information on how the nervous system is organized. So first of all, why do we have a nervous system? Well, number one, it's really important at collecting all types of information. We have receptors, and receptors are structures that can receive and respond to stimuli. And what they do is they form what's called an action potential, which you've heard before, in response to what's called a threshold stimulus. So the receptor is what actually forms that nerve impulse or action potential. So they're usually associated with sensory information. Once they send that information up to the CNS is where we process and evaluate, the integration center. Now, the CNS stands for Central Nervous System, as you'll see shortly, and that's our brain and spinal cord. And then finally, our nervous system causes the response. It decides what to do and sends those instructions out to what are called effectors. So effectors are the structures that basically carry out the instructions from the nervous system. And again, it communicates through these action potentials or nerve impulses. Now, when we look at nervous tissue, we know that nervous tissue is also called neural tissue, and there's two types of cells here. So there's the neurons and the neuroglial, or you can say neuroglial cells. And you looked at these when we looked at tissues. Took a quick look at these. Now, neurons make up about 10% of all the nervous tissue. There's about 100 times more neuroglial cells than neurons, so they're very, very numerous. And when we look at the nervous system, we have organs. So we have the brain and the spinal cord are what are called the central nervous system. That's the processing area. We have receptors. Our sense receptors, our eyes and ears, are part of the nervous system. And then we have our nerves. Now, our nerves, you'll see, are part of what's called the PNS, or peripheral nervous system. And the nerves basically carry all that information and connect your nervous system to all organs of the body. There's some terms that you're going to need to know as we go through this system. So you're going to see somatic and autonomic. Sometimes you'll see visceral, but we usually say autonomic. Anytime you see somatic, it's referring to skeletal muscle, and it also can be referring to the skin. So somatic is usually like voluntary structure, so as far as muscle, voluntary muscle, and then usually the skin. Autonomic are things that are involuntary. So again, if we're looking at muscle, we would know that the autonomic is carrying information to either smooth muscle or has to do with cardiac muscle or glands. When you see afferent and efferent, now I pronounce them afferent and efferent so you know what I'm saying. Technically, we just say afferent and efferent, just so you know. But afferent is always carrying information to the CNS. So afferent is always going to be sensory information because this is the input. This is coming in. Efferent is always carrying information away from the CNS, and a lot of times we call that motor information. So these are some terms you need to memorize. If we look at the organization of the nervous system, there's three main divisions. So you have your central nervous system, which is your processing center. That's your brain and spinal cord. So that's the main control where everything is integrated process. Then you have the PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system. This is carrying information to and away from the CNS. That's its job. So afferent, remember, is always carrying information to it, and efferent or efferent is always carrying information away from it. Now, this information can be coming from somatic receptors or visceral. So if the incoming information is coming from maybe skeletal muscle, then we say that it would use the afferent somatic nerves, okay, because peripheral nervous system is going to be a lot of nerves. Maybe it's detecting stretch in a muscle. Maybe it's carrying it from smooth muscle. Maybe you're hungry right now as you read this and your stomach is growling. Well, if it's coming from visceral afferent, that just means it's coming from your involuntary structures, like your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, but it's going to the CNS because it's afferent. If we look at efferent is going away, so it has the instructions from the brain and the spinal cord. So efferent information can go to your skeletal muscles, maybe to make muscle contracts, and you might remember that somatic motor neurons, right, carry that type, excuse me, of information. We also have information going out to our autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, it's called the ANS, has two divisions. It has a sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the organs of the autonomic nervous system are your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. But it gets specialized whether it's carrying sympathetic autonomic or parasympathetic. So the entire autonomic nervous system is always efferent. It's always taking in information is coming from the brain and spinal cord to those structures. Our sympathetic is associated with our fight or flight response, which I know you've heard of, right? So your sympathetic nervous system. And then your parasympathetic, we sometimes say status quo. So when you're like resting and relaxing. Now the ENS stands for enteric nervous system. And this is the nervous system of your gut. And it's okay to say gut because it controls all your digestive organs. So you have a whole lot of neurons and nerves in your abdominal pelvic cavity in your gut, and their main job is to control digestion. In fact, there's more neurons in your gut than your entire spinal cord. So when we look at the organization, sometimes a picture is helpful. Our CNS is our control center, our integration. Information comes to it, sensory information, goes through afferent fibers. If that sensory info is coming from my skeletal muscle or my skin, we say it's somatic, because that's what somatic meant, somatic sensory. If it's coming from smooth muscles or glands, then we would say it's visceral sensory or visceral afferent. All of my efferent information is always going away from the CNS. If it's going to skeletal muscle, we call it my somatic division. So my efferent somatic. If it's going to my involuntary structures, we call that our autonomic nervous system. And so these are going to be the efferent division that's going to our autonomic, because it's going to things we don't control. And when it goes to our ANS, we're looking at smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and then that is under control. We talk about it being either sympathetic or parasympathetic. And so we go through each of these as basically a separate chapter as we study this system. We have a whole chapter on the spinal cord and the brain. We have a whole chapter on the peripheral nervous system, which functions on all those afferent and efferent nerves. The autonomic nervous system, I think that's chapter 14. It might change from book to book. That's not on Unit 3 exam. That's on your final exam. And we have a whole section dedicated to that. So this is the overview and the organization of the nervous system.